For 4 long days, a newborn lay abandoned on the cold church steps, forgotten by the world. No mother's arms, no father's voice, only silence. Townsfolk passed by, whispering about her fate. But just when hope seemed lost, a lonely Apache warrior stepped forward, looked into her tiny eyes, and said the words that would change both their lives forever. "Let's go home." Asterisk. The night was heavier than most, blanketed in a silence that felt almost unnatural. The clouds smothered the moon, and the stars hid their light as if unwilling to witness what was about to unfold. The wind rattled the trees with a low moan, carrying with it the smell of dust and old wood from the church that stood at the edge of town. At first, no one noticed. The townsfolk had retreated into their homes, shutters closed tight, lamps snuffed out early to save what little oil they had left. The town wasn't prosperous, and the people weren't quick to invite burdens. Every man and woman carried their own struggles, debts, illness, hunger. Nobody thought to step out into the blackness unless they had to, and so the sound was almost swallowed by the night, the thin, trembling cry of a baby. It came from the steps of the church, a hollow wooden cry at first, soft enough to be mistaken for the wind. But then it rose again, sharper, desperate, a fragile voice fighting against the vast emptiness around it. Inside the church, Father Michael stirred in his narrow bed. He was an older man, his back bent and his hands marked by years of labor. At first, he thought he was dreaming, some echo of his younger days when his parish had been fuller and babies' laughter still filled the pews. But the cry came again, thin and aching. This was no dream. He pulled on his worn coat and shuffled to the door, lantern in hand. When he opened it, the wind snuffed out the small flame almost instantly. Darkness pressed in, broken only by the faint outline of something lying at the top of the steps. Father Michael's heart clenched. He bent down, his knees groaning, and pulled back a tattered blanket. Inside, a baby no more than a few days old lay trembling. Her cheeks were red and raw from the cold, her lips quivering as she let out another piercing cry. "Oh, dear Lord," he whispered, his voice cracking. There was no note, no mark of who she was or where she had come from. No ribbon, no trinket, no clue. Nothing but a blanket so thin it could barely keep her warm. Whoever had left her had wanted her gone, and quickly. Father Michael gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of life that could be snuffed out if he didn't act quickly. He pressed her close against his chest and rushed her inside, shutting the heavy church door behind him. He lit the lantern again, the flickering glow casting long shadows across the pews. The old wooden church smelled of wax, dust, and cedar, but now it was filled with the sharp, urgent sound of the baby's cries. The priest placed her on the altar's cloth, his hands trembling. He searched for any sign of sickness or injury, praying silently she had not been harmed before being left. She was small, almost impossibly small, but her lungs, though weak, fought to be heard. "Who could leave you here, little one?" he whispered. His voice trembled not from anger, but from sorrow. He knew desperation when he saw it. Perhaps her mother had been too poor, too young, or too afraid. Perhaps she had been abandoned out of shame, or grief, or cruelty. The reasons could be endless, but none excused the act. The baby's cries softened for a moment, as if she sensed the gentleness in his voice. She blinked, her eyes opening just barely, dark, unfocused, but alive. Father Michael felt his chest ache as he gazed into them. He had baptized countless children, held them in moments of joy and innocence. But this was different. This was survival. He wrapped her tightly in one of the church's old altar cloths, coarse, but warmer than the rag she had been left in, and held her against him. He could feel her tiny heartbeat, rapid and fragile, against his chest. That night, he sat awake in the pews with the baby cradled in his arms, rocking her gently, whispering prayers into the silence. Outside, the storm passed, but inside the church, something new had been set in motion. A question lingered in the old priest's mind, one that would echo through the days to come. Was she meant to be found here? Was this chance or providence? For now, all he knew was this: a baby had been left to die on the steps of God's house. And though the world had abandoned her, Father Michael could not. The church bells tolled softly the next morning, their hollow chime carrying across the small town. It was not a call to service, but a quiet reminder. Something had changed inside those walls. By dawn, word had spread. Someone had left a baby on the church steps. At first, the townsfolk came with curiosity. They peered into the priest's arms as if the child were some strange discovery, not a living soul. Some cooed at her tiny face while others frowned, whispering to one another as though her very presence stirred unease. She must be cursed, one woman muttered under her breath. Why else would her own kin abandon her? Another shook his head. Or maybe she's just another mouth we can't afford to feed. Times are hard enough already. Father Michael silenced them with a firm look, but inside he shared their worry. The baby had been brought into a community already struggling to care for its own. He prayed for compassion, but in the faces around him, he saw more hesitation than hope. The priest placed the child in a wooden cradle near the altar, swaddled in layers of cloth he had gathered. Day after day he tended to her, warming goat's milk for her tiny stomach, singing hymns in a low voice to calm her restless cries. Her lungs, though small, filled a church with her fragile presence. But as the hours stretched into days, the same question echoed louder. Would anyone come back for her? On the second day, Father Michael sat by the door for hours, hoping to see a shadow appear on the horizon, a mother whose regret had led her home, a father ready to reclaim his child. But the path remained empty. Each knock of wind against the door was a false hope that withered quickly. By the third day, whispers had turned into arguments. The church pews filled not with worship, but with townsfolk debating her future. She should be taken to the orphanage in the city, one man declared. The priest is too old to raise a child, another retorted, and what would become of her there? Nothing but a number, lost among hundreds of other abandoned souls. At least here she has a chance. The voices grew sharper. Each person spoke of what was practical, what was convenient. But few spoke of love. Father Michael sat silently through it all, his hands folded tightly, his eyes heavy. He had seen enough of the world to know how it could harden hearts. Yet, when he looked at the child, so helpless, so innocent, he felt a flame of defiance stir within him. She had been given to him, to his church, to this town. Surely that meant something. By the fourth day, the baby's cries had grown weaker. She was eating, yes, but without the comfort of a mother's heartbeat or the warmth of familiar arms. Her body seemed to falter. Father Michael's chest tightened with fear each time she fell too quiet. That morning, he knelt before the altar, the child cradled against him. His prayer was not the calm, measured kind he usually offered. It was raw, desperate. "Lord, I am only one man," he whispered. "But she needs more than I can give. If it is your will she stays, then send someone. Send someone who will not see her as a burden, but as a blessing." The words trembled in the silence of the church. And then, as if in answer, the door creaked open. A shadow filled the frame. Tall, broad, and worn by the sun. A man who rarely entered town except for supplies. Lone Wolf, the Apache who lived alone on the edge of the hills. His presence drew the eyes of those inside, some wary, some distrustful, but Lone Wolf said nothing. His gaze moved past them all and landed on the cradle by the altar. The baby stirred, her weak cry rising again. And something in that sound, something in the way her tiny hand reached into the air, seemed to strike him like a blow to the chest. For 4 days the child had waited. And now, perhaps, the one she had been waiting for had arrived. The arrival of Lone Wolf at the church unsettled the townsfolk more than the baby's cries ever had. He was a solitary figure, broad-shouldered, his long black hair tied loosely, his face lined not only by age but by grief. People knew him as the Apache who lived apart, rarely speaking, never asking for help, and certainly never offering it. He was tolerated, but not embraced. Now he stood in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on the child in the cradle. His silence seemed to stretch across the pews like a heavy curtain, suffocating the whispered conversations that had been swirling only moments before. Father Michael was the first to speak. "Lone Wolf," he said gently, as if greeting a wild animal. "What brings you here?" The Apache didn't answer at first. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and came to stand over the cradle. He looked down at the infant, wrapped in cloth, her breath shallow, her lips faintly trembling. For a long while he said nothing. The baby whimpered, a sound so small it might have gone unnoticed by the crowd, but not by him. His jaw tightened, his broad hands curling into fists at his sides. As if holding back something unspoken, it was the townsfolk who broke the silence. "You've no business here," one man muttered. "This is church business, not yours. She belongs in an orphanage," a woman added, her voice clipped. "The priest can't keep her. None of us can. She needs structure," another man scoffed. "What are we even doing, keeping her here? She was left for dead." Perhaps it was meant to be. Gasps filled the room at that last remark, but it wasn't the priest who rebuked him. It was Lone Wolf. He turned, his voice low but firm. "Meant to be?" His gaze swept over them, sharp as an arrow. "A child abandoned is not the will of God. It is the failure of men." The words cut through the air. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. Father Michael closed his hands tightly in prayer, silently thankful someone had spoken the truth aloud. But he also knew the battle had only begun. The debate resumed, sharper than before. "Should drain our resources. She's innocent. How can you say that? She doesn't belong to us. She belongs to someone. We can't just throw her away again." The baby's weak cries punctuated each exchange, a sound so raw and human it made the argument seem cruel in comparison. Yet still, the townsfolk wavered. Some hearts softened at her tiny voice, while others hardened, already calculating the cost of another mouth to feed. Father Michael finally raised his voice above the noise. "Enough! This child was left in God's house. That makes her our responsibility, whether you want it or not." But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of his own words. He was old, his strength waning. He could pray, he could love, but could he raise her? Could he protect her from a world so ready to discard her? His eyes drifted toward Lone Wolf. The Apache hadn't moved, still standing watch over the cradle as though he were guarding it. His face revealed nothing, but his presence alone quieted some of the murmurs. The priest saw something then, something the others did not. In Lone Wolf's silence, in the way he lingered by the child, there was no indifference. There was recognition. Perhaps he saw his own story in her. Loss, abandonment, loneliness. The townsfolk eventually left, muttering as they went, divided between compassion and resentment. The church doors shut behind them, and the night crept in once more. Father Michael stayed behind with Lone Wolf, the two men standing in the candlelight, the baby's cradle between them. "You came here for a reason," the priest said quietly. Lone Wolf didn't look at him. His eyes remained on the child. "4 days," he murmured, his deep voice breaking slightly. "She has waited 4 days and no one has come." The words were not a question. They were a truth, heavy and undeniable. Father Michael nodded, his throat tight. "No one. The Apache bent slowly, his massive hand hovering over the baby's chest, as if afraid his touch might be too rough. But when he finally rested his fingers lightly against her, she stilled. The cries ceased. Her tiny body relaxed, as if she recognized something in him no one else could offer. The priest felt his eyes burn. In that fragile, quiet moment, the child who had divided the town had chosen for herself, and perhaps so had Lone Wolf. Lone Wolf had always been a man of silence. He lived on the ridge beyond the town, in a small cabin he had built with his own hands years ago. Few ventured near it, and fewer still were welcomed inside. To most, he was little more than a shadow at the edge of their world, an Apache who kept to himself, a man bound to a past they neither knew nor cared to ask about. But silence had not always been his way. Once there had been laughter. Once there had been warmth. Her name had been Anna. She was not Apache, but their love had been fierce enough to weather every disapproving glance, every whispered word. They had built a life together in that cabin, a fragile piece carved out of two worlds that rarely touched. He had called her his anchor, his light. When she told him she was carrying his child, Lone Wolf had thought the Creator had finally blessed him beyond measure. He spent weeks preparing, carving a cradle, hunting extra meat, storing away wood for the long winter. He would sit by the fire, his hands resting on her belly, whispering words in Apache, promises of protection, of love, of a father's devotion, but the child never came. Not alive, anyway. Anna had gone into labor early, her body too weak to endure. Lone Wolf had carried her in his arms, helpless, as she bled and wept and fought to hold on. By dawn, both she and their unborn child were gone. He buried them side by side beneath the tall pines, the earth wet with his tears. And from that day forward, the laughter in his cabin died. The cradle he had carved sat untouched in the corner, a ghost of what could have been. The townsfolk said Lone Wolf had grown cold. That grief had turned him hard. In truth, grief had hollowed him out. He no longer prayed. He no longer hoped. He simply endured. That was the man who walked into the church 4 days after the baby had been abandoned. That was the man who now stood, staring down at the fragile infant, his heart betraying him with an ache he had long since tried to bury. He hadn't come with a plan. Truthfully, he hadn't even meant to come at all. He had heard the whispers in town about the abandoned baby, the arguments, the pity, the contempt. At first, he ignored them. It wasn't his concern. But then, alone in his cabin that night, he thought of the cradle. He thought of the child he had never held, and he thought of the tiny cry carried on the wind. Echoing in his mind, it had pulled him toward the church like a tide he couldn't resist. Now, standing over the cradle, he felt the same sharp grief that had nearly destroyed him years before. Yet beneath it, something else stirred, something dangerous. Hope. He reached out, hesitating. His hands were calloused, rough from years of work, but when his fingers brushed the baby's tiny hand, she didn't recoil. Instead, she grasped him with surprising strength, her small fist curling around his finger as though claiming it. The moment pierced him. For years he had convinced himself he had nothing left to give. But this child, this abandoned soul, did not see a broken man. She saw only the warmth of his touch. Lone Wolf's throat tightened. He wanted to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of solitude. But he couldn't. Not when her grip was so sure, so trusting. The priest watched quietly from the shadows, understanding more than he said. He had seen grief in many forms, but he had never seen it crack so suddenly, so painfully, into something resembling love. "You've lost much," Father Michael said softly. "But maybe she was sent to remind you that you have more to give." Lone Wolf didn't reply. His gaze remained fixed on the child, her dark eyes fluttering open, meeting his. For the first time in years, he felt the weight on his chest shift just slightly. as though someone had lifted a stone from it. He knew he was still broken. He knew his scars ran deep. But as the baby cooed softly in his hands, he wondered, perhaps for the first time, if broken pieces could still be enough to build a. The church was quiet again, its flickering candles casting shadows on the old wooden beams. Only two sounds filled the air, the shallow breaths of the infant and the slow, steady heartbeat of Lone Wolf loud in his own ears. For 4 days, the child had been passed from arm to arm, pitied and debated but never truly claimed. Her fate had been discussed like a burden, weighed like grain, measured like coin. Yet now, as Lone Wolf bent over her cradle, something shifted in the room, something no one could name, but everyone could feel. Father Michael watched closely. He had seen many people stand over that cradle with cold detachment or uncertain pity. But Lone Wolf was different. He wasn't peering at her as though she were someone else's problem. He wasn't recoiling from her cries. He simply stood, steady and silent, as though rooted to the earth by some unseen bond. The baby stirred, her weak cries softening into whimpers. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes. They were dark, unfocused, but alive. And though she could not yet understand, it seemed as if she saw him. Her small body shifted, her hands stretching into the air, grasping blindly until her fingers brushed against his. Lone Wolf froze. Her tiny grip was no stronger than a breeze, but it stopped him cold. His chest tightened, his breath caught. For years his hands had known only the weight of tools, the tension of a bow, the roughness of stone. Now they were claimed by something impossibly fragile and impossibly brave. A hush fell over the room. Even the priest felt his throat tighten at the sight. The baby held on as though she had always known him, as though she had been waiting for him. Lone Wolf's face, usually carved from stone, faltered. His eyes closed, just briefly, and when he opened them, there was a sheen of pain and something else. Something softer. Why her? He whispered, though the words were meant for himself, not the priest. Father Michael answered anyway. Because she reached for you. Sometimes that is reason enough. The Apache's jaw tightened. He should have stepped back. He should have left her to the town, to the priest, to someone else who wasn't broken, who wasn't haunted. But her tiny fingers would not let go, and neither, it seemed, could he dot behind him. The heavy church doors creaked. A few townsfolk slipped in, drawn by curiosity or gossip. Their voices were hushed but sharp. "What's he doing here?" One man whispered. "Don't tell me he's thinking of taking her. He can barely take care of himself." The words reached Lone Wolf's ears, though he didn't turn. He had grown used to being doubted, mistrusted. But now, as the baby clung to him, their whispers cut deeper than they ever had before. For the first time in years, he wanted to fight, not for himself, but for her. The baby whimpered again, and instinctively he lifted her from the cradle. She was impossibly light in his arms, her warmth pressing against the scars of a chest that had forgotten what it meant to hold someone. She quieted instantly, her tiny face nuzzling into his shirt, as if she had found where she belonged. The townsfolk gasped softly, as though he had crossed some invisible line. "She knows him," Father Michael said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but firm. "You all see it. She knows him." Lone Wolf looked down at the child, her breaths now steady, her grip still strong on his finger. And in that moment, for the first time since burying Anna and their unborn child, he felt something bloom inside him, something terrifying, something beautiful, a chance. The priest's words echoed in his mind, as though whispered by something higher than either of them. Sometimes, that is reason enough. For the baby abandoned at the church steps and the man abandoned by fate, their paths had finally crossed. And neither would ever be the same. The church was crowded that evening. Word had spread fast. Lone Wolf had been seen cradling the abandoned baby in his arms. By dusk, half the town had gathered inside the sanctuary. Curiosity and suspicion painted across their faces. Candles flickered, casting wavering light over the worn pews. Father Michael stood near the altar, his expression heavy with both hope and dread. At the center of it all, Lone Wolf sat silently, the child swaddled in his arms. She was asleep now, her tiny breath steady, her hand curled against his chest as though she had claimed him entirely. The room should have been hushed, reverent even, but it wasn't. She doesn't belong to him. A woman's voice rang out, shrill with fear. He's not fit to raise a child. He lives like a savage on the ridge, alone. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He's no father. She'd be better off in the orphanage. Better than being raised by him. The word stung, though Lone Wolf didn't flinch. He had heard worse. But this time, the sting wasn't for himself. It was for the child. Father Michael lifted a hand, calling for silence. Enough! This child has waited 4 days. 4 days, and not one person here has stepped forward. Not one has offered to claim her. Yet you condemn the only man who has held her as if she mattered? The words cut through the noise, but the faces in the crowd remained tense, wary. Fear ran deep here, fear of the unknown, fear of difference. And then Lone Wolf rose. He stood tall, the baby still nestled against him, her small body barely visible in the folds of his arms. His shadow stretched long across the church floor, commanding attention without a word. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of something unshakable. "She has a father now," he said. The room stilled. The words landed with the force of an oath, simple yet unbreakable. Murmurs erupted instantly. "You can't. She's not yours. This is madness." But Lone Wolf did not waver. His dark eyes swept the room, sharp and unyielding. No one came for her. Not her mother, not her father, not any of you. For 4 days she cried and none answered. I hear her. I will not turn away. He shifted slightly, lowering his gaze to the infant in his arms. His voice softened. She has waited long enough. She will not wait any more. Father Michael's throat tightened. He had prayed for someone to come, anyone who could see the child as more than a burden. Now, watching Lone Wolf cradle her, his prayer felt answered. "This is not a decision to be made lightly," the priest said carefully, his eyes meeting Lone Wolf's. "It will change everything." Lone Wolf nodded once. "Then let it." The church fell into uneasy silence. Some shook their heads, whispering bitterly. Others stared, uncertain, caught between prejudice and the undeniable truth they had witnessed. The child had chosen him. The baby stirred then, her tiny cry breaking the tension. She shifted against his chest, her little hand gripping the fabric of his shirt, her voice soft but insistent. Lone Wolf rocked her gently, his broad hand cradling her head with a tenderness that silenced even the harshest. Whispers. The sight was undeniable. It was not logic, not practicality, not even faith that settled the matter. It was the image of a child who had been abandoned, and the man who refused to abandon her again. When Lone Wolf turned to leave, no one stopped him. The heavy church doors groaned open, the night wind rushing in. He stepped through, the baby pressed firmly against his heart, her cries fading into soft murmurs as if she knew, at last, she was going home. Behind him, the townsfolk watched in silence. Some frowned, others wiped at their eyes, but all of them knew what had just happened. An abandoned child had been claimed. A broken man had spoken life into both of their futures, and with 4 simple words, "She has a father now," everything had changed. The cabin on the ridge had long been a place of silence. For years, the only sounds inside were the crackle of firewood and the sigh of wind pushing through the cracks in the walls. The cradle in the corner sat untouched, gathering dust like a tombstone to a dream that never came true. But now, silence was a stranger. The baby's cries filled the cabin, sharp and insistent, demanding more than Lone Wolf knew how to give. At first, he stumbled through each hour like a man caught in a storm, fumbling with milk, unsure how to hold her without fear of breaking her fragile body. He would pace the wooden floor in the dead of night, the child wailing in his arms, his mind fraying with exhaustion. Once, in his frustration, he whispered aloud, "I don't know how to be what you need." But she only blinked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, as if to say, "Then learn." And so he did. Slowly, clumsily, he began to piece together the art of fatherhood. He learned how to warm milk just right, how to rock her until her cries melted into soft sighs, how to carry her on his chest so she could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat. The old cradle that had once mocked him was cleaned and mended, and for the first time it held a living child. The nights were still long, but they were no longer empty. He would sit by the fire, humming low Apache lullabies that had not been sung in his cabin since Anna's time. Sometimes the baby would fall asleep in his arms, her tiny hand clutching his finger, and he would stare into the flames with a mix of fear and wonder. In her, he saw not just the child he had lost, but the chance to love again. The townsfolk watched from a distance, unsure what to make of it all. Some said he was unfit, that it was only a matter of time before he gave up. Others, though they would never admit it aloud, felt something soften inside them when they saw him in the market with the baby strapped to his chest, her small head tucked against his shoulder. Father Michael visited often, bringing milk and advice, but mostly encouragement. "Love is more important than perfection," he reminded Lone Wolf one evening. "A child doesn't need flawless hands. She needs faithful ones." Lone Wolf took the words to heart. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between man and child grew unbreakable. She laughed now, bright, bubbling sounds that filled the cabin with life. Each giggle felt like a piece of his shattered heart being stitched back together. She crawled across the floor, her little fingers tugging at his boots, her eyes shining with trust that he had never thought he would deserve again. He was still a man marked by grief, still scarred by loss, but with every soft breath of the child against his chest he realized something profound. Broken pieces can still build a home. The townsfolk began to see it too. Where once they had doubted, they now watched with quiet awe. They saw how she reached for him in a crowd, how she calmed at the sound of his voice, how his once empty cabin now glowed with firelight that spilled out into the dark hills. Lone Wolf did not boast. He did not seek their approval. He only lived day by day, with the small girl who had been left to die but had chosen to live with him. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lone Wolf carried her outside. The wind brushed through the tall grass, and the child squealed in delight. Reaching her arms toward the horizon, he lifted her high, his arms strong, his heart trembling. She laughed, her voice ringing out across the ridge, clear and joyful. And for the first time in years, Lone Wolf laughed with her, a deep, booming sound that startled even him. The ridge, once silent, now echoed with the sound of life. And in that moment, he knew this was not just her beginning. It was his too. Years slipped quietly across the ridge, measured not by calendars but by the laughter of a child growing into herself. The cabin that once echoed with grief now pulsed with life, the patter of small feet on wooden floors, the smell of bread baking on the hearth, the sound of stories told in both English and Apache beneath the glow of firelight. The baby abandoned on church steps was no longer a fragile bundle. She had grown into a bright-eyed girl, her hair wild in the wind, her laughter a song that carried down the hills into the valley. On warm mornings, she would dart barefoot through the tall grass, her arms outstretched like wings. Lone Wolf would follow at a slower pace, his deep laugh rumbling as she shouted, "Catch me, Papa!" he always did. To the townsfolk, it was strange at first to see the Apache warrior, once a man of silence, chasing a child with joy in his eyes. But over the years, their suspicion softened. Some even came to admire what they saw. A man who had chosen love where others had turned away. A man who had taken brokenness and built something whole. Father Michael never missed a chance to remind the town of it. That little girl was left to die, he would say. Now she runs free because one man said, "Let's go home," and home she had. The cabin on the ridge became more than 4 walls and a roof. It became a sanctuary where the child learned not just to survive, but to belong. Lone Wolf taught her the songs of his people, the ways of the land, how to track deer through the forest, how to listen for the whisper of water beneath stone, how to honor the earth with gratitude. At night, when the stars burned bright above the pines, he told her of Anna. He spoke not with sorrow, but with reverence, teaching her that love does not die, it simply changes shape. The girl would listen wide-eyed, her small hand clutching his, and whisper, "I'm glad she sent me to you." Those words never failed to undo him. The townsfolk eventually stopped whispering about curses and burdens. They saw instead a little girl skipping through the market with braids in her hair and a proud father walking beside her. Some even waved. Others offered small gifts, a ribbon, a loaf of bread, a smile they had once withheld. The girl belonged not just to Lone Wolf, but to the world that had once turned its back on her. And yet she never doubted where her truest home was, in the steady arms of the man who had chosen her when no one else would. One summer evening, years after that first night on the church steps, Lone Wolf and his daughter stood on the ridge as the sun sank low. The sky blazed orange and gold, painting the valley in firelight. The girl, now tall enough to stand shoulder to shoulder with him, slipped her hand into his. "Papa," she said softly, "do you think I was meant to find you?" Lone Wolf looked down at her, his weathered face breaking into a slow smile. "No," he said. "I think we were meant to find each other." The wind stirred the grass, carrying her laughter into the open sky. Lone Wolf joined her, his deep voice rolling like thunder, and for a moment the ridge seemed to glow with something larger than both of them. Once she had been abandoned. Once he had been broken, but together they had turned loss into belonging, and as the last light of day faded into the embrace of night, it was clear. The story that began with despair had become one of redemption, not because of blood, but because of choice. She had a home. He had a daughter, and they had saved